Thank you, Seth, and thanks to you and to Marissa for your important assistance in getting this program ready for today. Um, NCNK members, present and past, have a long history of involvement in North Korea on matters related to agriculture. A little later in the program, I will be making reference to some of our past and present members who've been involved in the ag area. But now we are really honored to have Dr. Jerry Nelson with us, Dr. Linda Lewis. Jerry Nelson, Linda and Jerry both are longtime NCNK members. They both are pioneers in terms of agriculture, North Korea, all the issues related to agriculture. And so it's an honor to have them with us today, not as viewers, but Jerry as a presenter, and then Linda as discussant. Jerry Nelson joined the University of Missouri in 1967, where he was active in research and teaching on crop production. As professor emeritus, he works mainly on international programs through the Asian Affairs Center interest in the DPRK, he works mainly on international programs through the Asian Affairs Center. His interest in the DPRK grew rapidly after joining American Friends Service Committee delegations to North Korea in 2006, 2008, 9, and 11. On-farm visits provided good insight about agriculture, and his visits with leaders of the Academy of Agricultural Science provided a framework for collaboration among scientists. And Jerry has a much longer bio, which you have already received. Linda as well. As relates to Linda, she is a former American Friends Service Committee country representative for China and North Korea. She had been based in Dalian, China, responsible for AFSC's DPRK program, including its longstanding ag development project. She was a regular visit to the DPRK and organized numerous study tours and exchanges outside Korea for DPRK partners. She spent much of her career living and working on or near the Korean Peninsula, including her service in South Korea as a Peace Corps volunteer, a Fulbright grantee and research fellow, and an international program director. Again, each of their bios are available to you. Please review them later at length. But now, Jerry, we will turn it over to you for you to get into the topic of food production as an integral activity in North Korea.
Thank you, Keith. And thank you to the folks in the audience for participating today. We're going to cover a very important topic, maybe from a different angle than you've heard before. But I think a looming question is, can North Korea feed itself in the near future? The long term may be different, but we're looking at the near future, in other words, the next 5 to 10 years. There'll be a lot of reading on the slides as well, so I won't repeat all of that. But certainly, if you visited North Korea and landed in Pyongyang, you'd get an impression. When you go out on the side outside Pyongyang, however, the impression changes markedly. And let's go to the next slide. You all know where North Korea is. Most of you have never visited. Fortunately, I've been able to visit 4 times, thanks to American friends, and a couple times with Linda Lewis that you're going to hear about in a few minutes. North Korea obviously is north of South Korea, but we don't get an idea of the dimensions of it very well until we start looking at the size of the country and its topography. North Korea is 80% mountains. That's a lot when you're trying to feed people because the mountains have their restrictions. That means 20% of the land is used for cities, farms, etc. Pyongyang has 3.5 million people. There are 14 other cities with 300,000. And so at 26 million people, there's a lot to feed. Hard to say how that would work. But for an analogy, if you think about Indiana, a proud, very productive state in the Midwest in the US, there'll be some analogies. But first, you'd have to shave off the right-hand side of Indiana and make it mountainous. Then along the left side of Indiana, you'd have to come halfway up and make that mountainous. And then just let's make it more typical, and we'll include Chicago. Increase the population a bit of Indiana, and feeding Chicago on a fourth the land area of Indiana would be a major challenge, as we can understand. And particularly if you put a boundary around that state and the city of Chicago, and nothing could go in or out. It's going to be self-sufficient. Very tough. The major crops we're going to deal with are a little different, and they're listed there. And there's horticulture crops as well as field crops. But let's go on to some of the challenges. Next slide. The rainfall is different from Indiana. The amount of rainfall is about the same, but the distribution is tremendously different. Most of the rainfall comes in July and June, whether on the east side of North Korea or on the west. Pyongyang's in the middle. That means in the spring, there's a real deficit when they try to plant rice, and particularly getting it watered and going and flooded. That's a challenge because where does the water have to come from? It has to be stored in some way. Then we get the big area of flooding and everything's going the other direction. Water's running everywhere. How are they going to control it? And then it dries off in the fall. So it's fairly dry for corn and rice harvest, but a very challenging distribution of rainfall. And that's why we're going to discuss a little bit on forestry as well as agriculture. Next slide. A major issue that's coming to realization in North Korea is climate change. There's been almost a 2 degrees centigrade increase since 1918, and the warmer temperatures in the summer and winters are increasing every year. It's been almost 1.7 degrees between 2000 and 2040. In the end, in 2040, the growing season is expected to be about 3 weeks longer than it is now. That's a benefit, because oftentimes they can start using 2 crops instead of just 1. The annual rainfall will be the same, and probably the distribution would be similar because of the monsoon climate and the issues that they're facing there, having the ocean on both sides. The severe rainfall events are going to perhaps increase. There's going to be a longer time between those events, and the sea level is going to increase by about 0.8 of a meter on the east, and about 0.8 of a meter, but it's going to intrude on the west and the east. Now they're going to gain some land back, but the estimates are with reclamation, it's going to take 20 to 50 years to get that land back up where it can be used without having flooding. So there's a greater potential for double cropping, but what crops and what sequence, that's another issue. And there's a great interest in expanding the use of greenhouses, particularly for vegetable production, and using these plastic houses that are erected in the field and using solar heat. Remember, energy is a challenging factor. But what plants can they use and how are they going to be done? And who's going to train the construction people and the management people? It's a big challenge out there. Next slide. If we look at food production, it's not simple. It's an integrated activity and must be based on a whole series of activities that are interrelated and at the same time somewhat discrete. We need to be evaluating them in some sequence, but at the same time integrating. But let's take a look at forest resources. We have already talked a little bit about the climate resource. We haven't discussed much on the animal resource, although North Korea is very interested in animal production. The crop resource is the main component that we're dealing with. The soil resource is the most important factor when we get dealing with crops, in addition to the climate. And then obviously the human resources to make this all fit together and work in a way that's going to be beneficial, not only to the country's people, but the long-term sustainability of the country. With that in mind, let's go to the next slide. A major change occurred in 2010. This is when they started to realize that global change is occurring. And one of the things in North Korea was that they needed to restore the forests. And this would reduce the flooding coming off the sloping soils around in the forested areas, and also soil erosion. When these heavy downfalls are coming and there's not enough trees to intercept the pressure of the raindrops, it causes more soil erosion, then all the water running off makes a difference too. So they decided to split the responsibilities into two ministries. Prior to 2010, the Ministry of Agriculture was the main one that dealt with the farms and agriculture and the farming systems. Then they changed that, and now they've added part of that responsibility to the Ministry of Land and Environmental Protection, two separate ministries. Now, they have governance over the land that's greater than 15% slope. And their goal is forest improvement to capture the carbon dioxide and fuel and construction material. In contrast, the Ministry of Agriculture has a land that's less than 15% slope. Now, they have an Academy of Agricultural Research for basic science knowledge. There's an agricultural extension system that translates that information into farming practices and uses it then to advise the farm managers on what to do. Now, most of the farms have 10 to 20% of land with greater than 15% slope, which meant that there's fewer acres, or in his case, hectares of land available for food production. At the same time, they need more food. They've reduced the land area available to produce it. And the farm manager now serves two ministries, which may have different perspectives on how the land could be operated. Next slide. Now let's take a look at this. Here's a picture we took a few years ago in the grain fields prior to the change in ministries. You notice on the left-hand side, the corn on the slope is greater than 15%. So that's no longer going to be used for crop production. It must be converted to forests. On the same side, in the same case, in the lower right, that corn in the area is some of about 15% slope. So some may be remaining in corn production. With good water management, they still have to control erosion. And then obviously the flatter land is not going to be a challenge because, and rice can be planted there. So this will have little effect on rice production per se, but it's going to affect corn and other crop production, which is on these sloping lands. But controlling the soil erosion is critical, very critical in the long term, but there's less land for food production. Let's go to the next slide. This just illustrates what happens. On the left-hand side, you can see the field planted to corn, and it has various dams that are set up going down a slope so that the water can be intercepted, and then it can flow laterally around at a much smaller slope, and then deposited in this place where it's not going to cause any erosion. But when heavy rains come in the summer, the upper blue area shows there's a break in the dam. And that water then is accumulated, flows into the next terrace. And then it's doubled. And then there's another break on the left. That doubled water goes in the next one, and the next one, and the next one. And you can see as it goes down, pretty soon, those terraces are no longer in existence. So the farms try to keep those terraces up, but it's very hard without having mechanical help in terms of developing them in engineering. Now, in contrast, one of the things that we worked with American Friends with was on using perennial legumes or grasses, growing them on the contour. That way, the grass or the legume would intercept that rainfall and reduce the erosion problems by splashing, plus it would reduce the runoff, and that then would help preserve that soil. Conceptually, then, a fruit or a forest tree could be planted on the contour, not between every row, but every few rows, in a sequence, so we'd end up with sort of an agricultural forestry transition as they move towards a total forest establishment. This would still allow them to have some forages there that could get cut occasionally, maybe by hand, and fed to goats or rabbits or something. But to try to transition this crop system so it can still take advantage of them as during the time that they're developing a forestry system. I haven't been able to follow up to see how much of this has come into play, but the early assessments were not necessarily going to be adapted quickly. And I'll tell you a bit more about that in a minute. Next one. So the concept then, if you look at this fruit apple orchard up in the back, the apple trees themselves can't keep the erosion under control. They have to have something else. And then the question in the farm managers are saying, well, would fruit trees count as forest? That's a question that has not been answered yet, as far as I know. And what will be the change in terms of the amount of trained workers and government marketing strategies if that land belongs to the environment side as opposed to the management side? Now, in the front, you'll see the saplings of the apple trees to be transplanted. They have good rootstocks and good tops for making the necessary grafts to transplant. And in the same time, unfortunately, you see the slope is downhill, which is not going to contribute very much to to reducing soil erosion. But they do plant corn on the ridges between it. So grain is still an important point, but this would not work because the slope is the wrong direction. And you'll note that soil clods, or at least I can, are brown because there's low organic matter, and the clunk, they stick together because the particles or clay are going to be adhesive and cause those clods to form rather than having a loose, friable soil. Next slide. So what's the time scale? Well, here we can see some things. They're talking about 2050, which is 25 years or so. On the left, you see the map, and you can see where the mountain ranges, the highest ranges are. But those areas in green are where the crops are produced, and that 20%, and the rest of it is mountainous, which is going to be difficult for crop production. There's some crop production along the eastern sideline, but it's quite close to the mountain ranges, so it's not as voluminous as it is on the west. Now, if you look at the upper part, it says this is the land cover in the 1980s. And then they're projecting what it now to what it was in the 2000s. But you can see how much deforestation had occurred. In other words, the blue is decreased, the yellow is increased, the yellow is the cropland. And then they put in the middle of the area to be planted. And this is based on some plans that were been made public, but those are the areas they have a priority in planting. And they want to move it as fast as they can. So now we go down to the lower left, and this is the land cover of the 2020s. But notice that there's a little bit of assistance or help in getting more trees planted compared to what was going on in 2000. But there's still a ways to go, and this is anticipated on the lower right by 2050. The problem is, and I'll talk about it in a minute or two, that right now, the deforestation is much higher than the reforestation. It's about 1 reforested per 5 deforested. Got a long ways to go. Next slide. They're growing seedlings, but I haven't been able to figure out what tree species are being used for the reforestation. I could talk about it a bit later, but they have native species, and some people think that's what they're going to try to use. Others think maybe it'd be something based on adaptation or for a specific use, for construction or for fuel or whatever. They want to transplant 1 to 2-year-old container seedlings in the spring because a container seedling is different than a bare root seedling, which is very subject to dying because of no water. And then last, what tree management systems in the long run will be most productive? And that I have not seen any information on this at all. But let's go to the next slide. As I mentioned, water is a real issue. First of all, it runs off very quickly off those hills they're putting the forests in. But during the dry periods, the leaves in the forest are taking the water, and when you transplant plants out there, the roots are going to be confined into a small volume, and they need to get water to get the roots to penetrate out into the original soil around them. But you try to get water into the mountains with no electricity, and it's done mechanically by humans. And this man and woman are working to fill this tank, buckets with water. There's a hose, kind of a gray part in the back there, and they'll go along by the trees and put a little bit of water in all the trees and come back and get more water. It's going to be a long time to reforest all of that with this type of technology. Come back to that in a few minutes. Next slide. The other thing is the soils. We get the water and the soils put together, it makes a big difference. Now the pH is low, it's about 5.2. We would like to see a pH 6 to 6.5. but potassium is very low, and that's a stress resistance. So it's going to be able to handle heat stress or cold stress, etc. Phosphorus is low, which improves the rooting of the crop plants, and so they're more drought hardy. Soil organic matter is very low, which means the water that lands on the soil doesn't percolate down very fast. It's bound to run off. Those are the issues of the chemical properties. The physical properties, without very much organic matter, the soil is very hard. They've got poor aeration. So we need to do something in terms of improving those physical properties to get better rooting and water holding capacity. Then the biological properties, all of the insects and the other microorganisms that are living in the soil have very important biological functions in terms of increasing the ability of the water to flow through, the aggregation of the soil particles into not small pieces, but bigger pieces. And above all, thing into the bottom is nitrogen. The phosphorus and potassium are important, and particularly phosphorus, which is very low. Phosphorus has to be imported, primarily from China, from Russia, other countries. The most expensive nutrient we have in terms of soil improvement. On the other hand, nitrogen, part of that could be fixed by legumes, taking the nitrogen from the air, converting it over to a form that's useful for the plants. And it could manufacture, the legumes can make up to maybe 50% of the subsequent nitrogen requirements if they had the legumes that were adapted in fixing nitrogen. North Korea manufactures some fertilizers, but nowhere near everything they need. And there are always transport logistics and application timing that are very difficult to manage. So in the long run, they depend mainly on compost made from crop residues manure. Next slide. This is an old graph, and I can't get good data for the other end, but there's the food need by the population, and I've extended that graph out a ways. And there are two things that are going on. One, that old people are getting older, and now they're desiring a higher birth rate, which means there's going to be a need for even more food. And the food production is very heavily dependent on the soil fertility. That's the important key in all of the food production as far as crops are concerned. Next slide. Just recently, they've established a procedure for the government that all the human waste now must be collected, made into a compost, and then taken to a distribution point. And if you read down through here, you'll find out that each rural citizen between 6 and 65 must donate 300 kilograms of human manure. It's almost degrading in a sense, because that human manure was one of the things they were able to use on their family gardens to help with their own food production. But now that's changed, and it's not very popular, to be honest with you. Next slide. So how can we improve that soil? Well, one thing would be to put a green manure crop, in this case, rye, plant in the fall. It grows in a rice field. They can come by and till it underneath, and that will mix with the soil and provide organic matter, plus the nutrients that the rye has absorbed into the soil, and that will improve its ability to produce the next crop. Next slide. Next one. This is an example of some work that American Friends had done with rice. The farmer is holding in his right hand is just the field with fertilizer, no green manure crop in it, as opposed to 4 years of having a green manure crop, and that's on his left. Tremendous difference in what that soil could do once it had that organic matter into it. The estimates are now, we think about 5 years at minimum to get it back up to a productive capacity, more likely 10 to get to restore that soil back to its original capacity. But you need seed for the crop, you need tractors, and you need fuel, which is not very easy to find. Next slide. My first visit, we visited a farm. We talked to the farm manager, and the fellow said, "How many tractors do you have?" It's about 2,000 acres. "We have 39. Well, then the guy said, "Well, how many of them are working?" In 2006, 13. 2011, only 4. little oil or fuel, and very low mechanical ability to keep things moving. That's an area that needs attention. Next slide. So how do the cooperative farms work? Well, there's got a farm manager, assistant managers for crops, one for animals and water. And they have this government quota that 80% will go back to the government. Here they're intercropping potatoes and corn. But on the right-hand side is wheat. The question I was asked is, could we double crop or could they double crop soybeans after the wheat? Well, yes, I know about that. So I walked out in the field and I was squeezing the kernels to see where they were in the terms of their development and their eventual drying. And I asked the farm manager through the translator, I said, when do you expect to harvest this wheat? So I'd get an idea when they could plant the soybean. The translator asked the farm manager and he whipped out his notebook and he said something back. June 26th. It was May. June 26th. Yes, June 26th. Then I learned later that if he does not harvest that wheat on June 26th, he's going to get a penalty if the yield is low. So he's going to harvest it on June 26th, no matter what. How can you operate a farm with a top-down management without very much flexibility among the managers to really see what's going on and do it right? Next slide. Here is a different one. This is potatoes, because they wanted to increase potato production for several reasons. And that was one of those in double rows. So they planted the potatoes, and then between them, they plant the rows of corn. Intercropping. In the back, you see the denuded hillsides that are going to have to be done something with in terms of forestry. Next slide. More than 80% of the rice is still transplanted by hand. They start to transplant early May, and all the people in White Church are from the city. They march out in the mornings and plant the rice and help. And then in the afternoons, they march back to the cities, and they'll come back out in the fall and harvest as well. But timing is so important. If you take the 1st of May, you can assume about 1 to 1.5% reduction in yield for every day. That means if they don't get it planted until the 30th, it's at least a 30% reduction in yield. Timing is so important, but that means you need equipment, and they don't have it. Next slide. That rice then is harvested in the fall by hand. Everything is cut off, dries some in the field, then they transport it to a thresher. Next slide. Here we walked along, and there was rice on the upper left-hand, rice stacked, waiting to be threshed. It'd probably been there for at least a month. This was in early December. And the question is, how long will it take? Well, if we went up, there are going to be major losses to different things. But if we go up the hill, and the picture on the lower right, there's the grain harvester or the thresher. Stationary, operates with electric motor, but there was no electricity that day. And there hadn't been for quite a few days, for that matter. And so they can't thresh the rice. They maybe produce it, but then they can't thresh it. And again, it's another problem. And that's not just on this farm, it's pretty much universal. Let's go to the next slide. The corn-soybean rotation, we thought would have some real benefit. Soybean can fix about 60 kilograms of nitrogen out of the air, and it alters the competition with weeds because of its growth habits and all these sort of things. And it's a high protein, high oil crop that would be beneficial dietarily. But soybeans don't like to have getting in a flooded soil. So they always, on the left, you can see little ridges. You have to plant the soybeans on the ridge tops, so the water will go into the valleys and keep the root system fairly dry. And they do have nodules on them, like in the lower left-hand corner, those little bumps in there, but those come from a bacteria that they must buy and then put it on the seed when they plant it, and the bacteria then will infect it and cause the plant to fix the nitrogen. Very powerful thing, but you cannot buy the bacteria in North Korea. American friends tried to do some things with it. I don't know for sure exactly the success. Next slide. Corn management is similar. They harvest the corn, they pick up all the stalks, they go back out, and in the far distance you can see them an animal there pulling a wagon, and they're picking up the leaves and everything else, and out further they're walking, picking up the kernels. When everything else is picked up, they put their chickens and poultry out there, and they pick up every grain that's there. That's all it was bare. And now they chop the stalks when there's electricity, and they're going to use that for other purposes. Next slide. Other uses for corn. Going down the highway, I took a picture out the back window of the van. Is that thing on fire? Well, yes. That truck is having a problem. Next slide. I learned that they could retrofit using some South American technology from the Second World War to generate methane, which goes to methanol, by smoldering corn cobs in the bottom of that drum on the truck. They can get about 30% efficiency, and these trucks will run on it for a while, but as you can imagine what goes on with the engine. But that's how desperate it is for fuel. Let's go to the next slide. The diets are very seasonal, and we can go into a bit more detail on it, but I don't want to spend a lot of time on it. On the crops, if you look at the green part in the graph over there, that tells when the crop is growing. Most of the time in July and August, the crops are growing, and that's when the hunger hits. That's when the previous crop has run out, they don't have enough, and that's the toughest time in the summer. Then they harvest in the yellow. They try to put potatoes in. Now that gets it a little bit better, earlier harvest, so it gets it a little bit better, but still it's a real challenge to get this particular gap in the food production at a point where it's going to be alleviated. The other thing, I got a phone call. So they want to get some greenhouses, et cetera, but then they use animal-based food for protein. And pork and the farms are getting about 3 to 12 dinners a year. So they will butcher a pig, share it among the other farm families, maybe have 1 or 2 dinners because they can't refrigerate it. And then later another one would harvest their pig and share it around. They're very innovative this way in terms of what they can do. Number 4, they use eggs as part of their diets, and particularly in school lunches. But typically a school lunch would be a scoop of rice and half a hard-boiled egg. But they started using these heavier complexes for beef and dairy. And next slide. Next slide there. This is, we'll go to the next one there. This is the greenhouses, and they're very interested in those. And they're designing them in a better way, but still, plastic is an issue. There's no plastic produced in North Korea because there's no fuel or industry of these organic compounds. So they get it from China. It lasts a year or 2. Other places have really good UV resistant plastic like South Korea in the last 8 or 10 years, but North Korea cannot afford that. Let's go to the next slide. But at the same time, they're starting about, I guess, 2 years ago, a vegetable and forest seedling greenhouse farm. Huge. 300 plus greenhouses growing these vegetables and fruits, hopefully distributing to the people. But the concern is it probably will end up in Pyongyang. And it's similar to the earlier apple production farms, and they have these beef and milk farms that they're trying to do. But we're going that direction in contrast to supporting the smaller farms. Next slide, please. Well, through AF, American Friends, we were able to host some scientists from North Korea to look at soil testing. And Linda was involved with this, and we really appreciate the help on that. But we brought 4 soil scientists to the university for 3 weeks of training. The fellow with his back to us, the big black bag, was the minder, translator. His background was in religion. It didn't have very much to do with agriculture. But with the 4 people in front between he and me, there was a tremendous discussion, learning about soybeans in the upper right, soils in the upper left, soils in the upper right. We went to the Missouri Botanical Garden where they did plant explorations and things, and they are looking at several new crops, which was an important component of what they were wanting to do. but their goal was to understand soils and soil testing. Let's go to the next slide. 3 weeks, meant 3 Friday afternoons. We brought the faculty from the university and the 4 soil scientists together and discussed what they were learning and how it was going. Tremendous learning experiences that were going on. Translation was not good because oftentimes we'd have this scientist from North Korea were working with a scientist from the university. There weren't enough translators. So they actually allowed some South Koreans to come in and do the translation. It was amazing. Next slide. We were especially honored. After about the first week, we got notification from the UN headquarters that they would like to send a couple of folks out to visit. And so they came for 2 days during the soil science program. And unquestionably, we're very, very impressed by the fact that we could have an academic university backing up these other areas where they could implement practices. Next slide. So we maintained regular visits. And then, of course, the mission went on, but Kim Jong-un came in. But even in 2016, they continued to propose that we assist with projects and the various ones on soil science, also on pasture and forage management, on the trees and forestry. And then even we were offered to have a joint MS program for scientists. Several proposals were made, but not all. Next slide. On an emotional moment during my last visit with Linda, we visited a farm that they were interested in, the North Koreans, of converting it from a rice farm to a vegetable and fruit farm. And that's the end. Anyway, so we went through this farm and visited, and the school kids were out, and they made a special effort, I think, to entertain us. And they did a little dance, and they sang a song. And I looked at those kids, all of them looking at their feet. One more question, back to the slide, just a second. Back to the slide. Okay, we looked at their feet. All pointed close together and pointed. Some looking down, some not, some happy, but the one boy on the front left kept staring. And I thought to myself, is there a well-known musician or someone else in that group? There may be. But I just hope they have enough food, even though the current outlook is not optimistic. So I wiped away a tear and walked. We must do something different. Thank you, and I'll turn it over to you, Keith.
Jerry, thank you for that outstanding presentation. For those in the audience, if you have questions for Jerry or for Linda, please submit those through the Q&A function. Linda, your turn. Linda?
I will try to make my comments brief so that there's some time for you to answer questions. First, in terms of my own perspective, I'm not an agriculture specialist. I'm an anthropologist of Korea. So you can see how valuable it is to have people like Jerry partner with us and come along and bring his expertise to the farms. I would also say, in terms of Jerry's presentation, though, that I myself have had experience working with agriculture on the Korean peninsula, not just in the north, but I first went to South Korea in 1970 in one of the first U.S. Peace Corps groups. And it happened that my project was working on community development. I lived in a small village with a farm family for a year, then spent 2 years at the National Office of Rural Development in Suwon, teaching English to Korean agriculture specialists who were going overseas for training on miracle rice. So some of these same problems occurred earlier in the south part of Korea too, which also has some of the same problems with mountains and lack of arable arable land. Now, I have three comments to add to what Jerry has to say. I hope they're short, but they have to do with the people who are going to be trying to solve these problems that Jerry has brought up. And one of the first things I would say, having done a lot of taking North Korean farmers out for training in other places, is that North Korean agriculture scientists, as Jerry has suggested, are really impressive in terms of their knowledge, their eagerness to learn, and their dedication, I would say, to improving Korean agriculture. What they lack is practical experience and access to information. Now, I remember one scientist who worked in a far out research station saying, just bring me a book, any book. I don't care what the language is. We can help farmers more. I'll find a way to translate it if we have more information. And I remember also taking a group to Beijing to learn about various things. And one of the guys was going through Beijing on the bus, and he's looking out the window and looking out the window and getting excited. Finally, he turned around and he said, you know, I'm a landscape architect and I work on making cities better. And that tree that's planted all over here, I know how important it is. And this is the first time I've ever seen it myself. And actually, in the University of Missouri delegation that Jerry talked about, I remember one time we went to a farm with the four of them, and they said, it's a huge farm, and they said, well, we employ 5 workers on the farm. And in the car going away, the North Koreans were talking. They said, you can't just run this farm with 5 people. How can they do it? This is impossible. You know, maybe they're lying to us. Why would they lie to us? And then later, we stopped and looked at a huge combine in the field. And the North Koreans were blown away. They had never seen this before. And afterwards, they started to say, well, maybe you could do it with five workers if you had this kind of machine. So this is just to say that it's difficult to organize delegations to take outside, but the results, in my experience, have been really great when it does happen. And it can have results. Now, what Jerry didn't tell you about the University of Missouri delegation was that 1 year after the delegation was there, when we went to North Korea and we talked again at the people in the Academy of Agricultural Sciences, we met with the head of the Soil Science Institute who gave us a report. And he said that based on what the scientists had learned at Missouri, they changed the methods that they used for analyzing the soil in North Korea. That they found that the U.S. methods were more effective, and so they changed their own system. So there can be profound results from this kind of interaction. Now, second, I would like to say that, as Jerry has pointed out, and I would second, there are limits to the implementation of good practices in agriculture. And these problems occur in other places that are more complicated than simply government level politics. And Jerry pointed out several of them, but one the AFS did come up against that problems in employing techniques for improving soil fertility. And Korean farmers understood the things you had to do. As Jerry has pointed out, they knew about crop rotation. They knew about things like low-till agriculture. But in some cases, to adopt these techniques involved accepting a drop in yields for a few years, or doing some other trade-off. And the question is that, can a farm manager tolerate losing yields for even a small period of time? You know, and Jerry has talked about this, and it's a problem not just for North Korean farm managers, but for lots of farm managers around the world. And farm managers don't have complete control over what they grow. You know, as Jerry points out, in farms that they have to produce lots of different things. Maybe they're not able to produce them. And I remember we took a bunch of North Korean farmers to an institute in China on rice research. And these farmers were farming on the coastline. And they said, you know, our soil is so saline. What can you tell us to do about this? And the Chinese experts just looked and said, choose a different crop. Don't raise rice. And they said, wait, we have to raise rice. And the Chinese farmer said, choose a different crop. That's the answer that we have for you. And as Jerry has pointed out, and trying to grow corn on sloping the hills, then we worked with the farms certainly where this was a problem. They were raising corn and it wasn't successful because the hills were too great. And again, taking these farm managers to talk to experts in China, they would say, don't raise corn, raise something else, do something else with the soil. And the Korean farm managers had to say, yeah, we can't. We have to raise the corn. So what can we do? So they do face these kinds of problems. And because they don't change their practices, there may be other reasons that they can't. And the third thing I would say is that AFSC found that farm managers are really change agents. They do have room to innovate, which is why AFSC focused there rather than up or down in terms of improving agriculture. And AFSC worked with only a few farms, but we would see that 4 different farm managers chose different ways of trying to solve the same problem, like too much rain, or what to do on slopes. And that suggested to us that they did have some space in what they did, and they did care about what happened on their farms. And also they could be quite creative. Like one way to improve the soil fertility is to cover up the soil at some time with rice straw. But as Jerry's pointed out, you know, rice straw, wow, it's used for so many things, for building mats, and it's used for fuel. And so the farm managers would put it on the field and people would come and take it. So one farm manager told us he waited till a rainy day and then he put it on the field. And when that happened, no one wanted to steal it. And that's how he succeeded in doing the practice. So I think that Jerry has done a great job of pointing out the issues, and that there are problems in implementing it all the way up and down the line, and that farm managers, in fact, are quite good, and delegations outside the country are really important for North Korean farmers. And that's all I have to say. Right?
Thanks, Linda. That's great. We have a number of questions, and for the sake of time, I would ask Jerry and Linda to respond as briefly and succinctly as possible. Jerry, Jennifer Diebert, also with American Friends Service Committee, asked, what is your advice to organizations as we begin to re-engage with North Korea agriculture partners?
I think the main thing is to be, like Linda mentioned, is to be open-minded. From an academic standpoint, we tend to be a little bit myopic. We know some of the situations that would work, but we also have to recognize that, as she pointed out, they may not work there. And so it's a matter of integrating what the people's concepts are and the technologies we can think, and how do we blend that into the things that could be practical and be adopted. I think the main thing here is stay open-minded. We cannot dictate. We have to encourage through open-mindedness.
Thanks, Jerry. So, Linda, reference was made in Jerry's presentation about the fact that, and you know as well, that farmers operate under tremendous pressure to deliver, right? They are told when to do certain things. And I was fascinated one trip to see corn, which had been laid out to dry in a road. The cobs were not fully developed. And I asked the farmer, why is this? And he said, well, we had to get ready to plant cabbage to double crop, right? So Linda, my question is, based upon your years on the ground, did you develop a sense of the percentage, and this would just be a projection, the percentage of crops that are lost due to premature harvesting?
That would be a component. Your
Go
next
ahead,
question.
Jerry. You've got the answer. I don't.
That would certainly be a component. The estimates that I come up with is that if you planted a seed of rice or corn, chances are you'll get 4/10 of that seed back. I mean, it's just about a 40% loss. It's incredible. And that drying is one of them because the kernels haven't completely developed and there's still some room for growth, and then you're drying it out. And then obviously all the other problems with diseases and insects and even just rots from the moisture in the seed are there. I couldn't tell you exactly, Keith, what the percentage would be, but it could very easily be at least 5% and probably 10% or maybe even 15 if you figure in the amount that's lost because it just lands on the soil and it's not in the cob and it's just sitting around there and wasted.
Very good. Thank you, Jerry. So Linda, the next question, we will start with you, and then we will turn to Jerry if he has additional comments. Mark Tokala with Korea Economic Institute asks, would land reform help? China had an increase in ag productivity when it decollectivized its farms. Linda, your answer?
Well, it's not a simple question to answer, but my simple answer would be I noticed that in working with local farms, that in fact there was a change to local responsibility system where the farm managers that we worked with allowed in an attempt to get the farmers to stop working on the hills in their own private plots to come down and work on the farms. And so they incentivized that by allowing local farmers to have more control over the farm, over where they worked, and to do it year after year, which suddenly made them come to us and say, we need test for soil fertility because we understand that that's going to make this more productive. So if you mean finding ways to let farmers have more control over the plots they're working on, probably yes.
All right, Jerry?
I would agree with that. Just following along, I just read an article about China and its movement that direction and how important it was, and following along, being old enough to recognize the Soviet Union. Once they allowed more decision-making by the individuals, things really took off because there was this incentive. There was a motivation to help. And many times when I'm in North Korea, I've talked to the farm managers and they will quickly admit that the people working on the farm with their own little gardens do a much better job than they can as a farm. So it's just one of those things collectively. The individuals can fine tune, they see the situation and take care of it, and there it is. So it's much better than the top down.
All right. So we have so many questions. Let me just select one more here. Linda Staley asks, when she was in North Korea, they were interested in rooftop gardens. Wondering if you had discussions with them about this or hydroponic gardens in buildings. Linda, and then Jerry.
No, I personally didn't see any, although there isn't a huge hydroponic operation that was set up, but not rooftop gardens. I didn't see. That doesn't mean that they weren't there, but I have no experience.
All right, Jerry?
Not very much from me either. The one crop that did come up was sugar beets. There was interest in sugar production in some of the places, but that was the only one. It was a root crop. Rutabagas and other turnips, etc. No general interest at all. Well, at least we ran into when I've been working with them. Root crops, of course, they're important. Vegetable crops, maybe beets, etc., but not more.
So, Jerry, what's the capacity for seed production in the North, specifically around forage and green manure crops?
Seed production is very poor, and that's a factor, not only just producing it, but cleaning it, getting the best kernels that you're going to use in your seed. The Germans put a lot of money into developing a factory, et cetera, for hybrid corn. And it ran for about 3 or 4 years, and then it didn't, the mechanical part of it started giving them problems, and they couldn't maintain it. But there they were doing all the breeding and getting the inbred, taking the seed, crossing them, and then developing the seed and cleaning it for the farm. There was no question it had a big impact, but it couldn't be maintained. That was the problem.
All right. Walter Keats, by the way, wrote in to say great information by both presenters. Congratulations. Jennifer Diebert again, and Linda. Linda, how does the level of loss of crops in North Korea compare with China or South Korea or the US? Do you have any background on that? And then Jerry, after you.
No, actually, I don't. But Jerry might.
Jerry?
Here in a sense.
My experience would be somewhat tangential, but I think that North Korea probably would win the race in terms of loss. South Korea's got much better farm machinery, for example, than the rice harvesting, and also some other things where they don't leave very much in the field. It's processed mechanically, it's cleaned and everything. And I would suspect in the whole process, they would have at least 1/3 less loss than North Korea. China, I'm not so sure about where it would be, but the loss is an issue. And remember that if you can save 10% of the loss, it takes 1.4 times that because you got 40% loss to overcome. So it's much better in terms of return on investment to reduce the loss than it would be to even increase the yield because you already have the yield, you're just protecting it.
All right. So I have a final question, first for Linda and then Jerry to respond to the same, please. You know, if Dr. Hazel Smith were with us, she would be talking about sanctions and the impact of sanctions on ag production in North Korea, right? Sanctions preventing getting more tractors in, bulldozers, et cetera, et cetera. Linda, tomorrow, if sanctions disappeared, if North Korea could receive as much machinery as possible, technology as possible, are they ready to handle that in terms of the ag leadership, in terms of the government's perspective on all this? I mean, sanctions goes away. How long would it take the country, do you think, to get to the point of ag production that would be possible based upon the availability of the necessary equipment and technology?
Well, I would say pretty quickly myself. And I would point out that sanctions have been on for 50 years. I used to say to North Koreans, gee, what would your life be like without sanctions? And they would say, well, we don't know because we've never lived with them, without them. And it's true. And even the difficulty that AFSC had in shipping plastic, simple things, really made it hard. And for farms to be sustainable, to be able to reinvest, for the country to be sustainable and to be able to reinvest, you have to have access to, to more equipment, to other things.
All right, Jerry?
As mentioned in the discussion, the information has to come in terms of a scientific package. And then the way it's operating now, that package then goes to the extension service and then it gets out to the farm managers if it's approved. I have been just totally amazed at how quickly they change their soil test recommendations. Now that was through the academy, so we already were linked with the research side. They just had to convince the extension people to get it out there and go. But as long as that hierarchy or chain of command is there, it's going to be a little bit slower. And so particularly if you're trying to introduce something that takes time, like hybrid rice or something of that nature, it would take quite a while.
All right, thank you. Thank you both. Before we sign off, I'd like to acknowledge some other NCNK members who have been or are involved in ways related to agriculture in North Korea. Rob Springs with GRS was in North Korea for quite a long time, had dairy and other projects. Randall Ierson, that Linda especially will recall. Randall was the AFSC country director, I believe 1998 to 2007, a very strong background in agriculture. Wade Sperry, a present member of NCNK, is heavily engaged in farm projects in North Korea through LDS Charities. apple production, dairy, etc. Hall Healy, who's chairman of the board of the International Crane Foundation. Hall and his organization are involved in improving crane habitats because of their impact on agriculture. Mennonite Central Committee has been involved a lot in the past, and I know Stacy Nam is poised and ready to go in when she can. Chris Rice also is active on the North Korea front. American Friends Service Committee, Jennifer Diebert's already been acknowledged, but once again, I know Jennifer is eager to get into the North. I'd also like to acknowledge Marcus Nolan, who has for years been writing, researching, studying the food security situation in North Korea from a range of angles. In fact, Marcus and Steph Haggard wrote a book years ago related to the famine, impact on markets, etc. And I know Marcus has a work coming out, a project that will be released through the East-West Center entitled Turning Back the Clock, the Changing Nature of North Korean Food Insecurity. So there are probably others that I omitted. My apologies to those individuals. But NCNK, our membership, has a strong track record, not only working in North Korea, but bringing North Korean ag specialists to the United States for training. That is there as well. And so if we get to the point where engagement is again possible, we look forward to the possibilities of this example and reality of people-to-people diplomacy at its best occurring once again. So thank you both. Thanks to our audience. And thanks again to Marissa and Seth, and have a good day.